In the early months of 1942, the war in the Pacific appeared to be moving inexorably in Japan's favor. Barely 4 months had passed since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In that short time, the balance of power in East Asia and the Western Pacific had shifted dramatically. The Doolittle Raid, carried out on April 18, 1942, would become the first American air attack on the Japanese home islands. Though tactically limited, it would signal that the United States was not defeated and that its capacity to strike back was only beginning to be realized. The strategic situation at the turn of 1941 to 1942 was bleak for the Allied powers. Japan, having planned a rapid series of offensives, struck almost simultaneously across a broad arc from the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft attacked American bases in the Philippines, including Clark Field and other installations on Luzon. Over the following weeks, Japanese forces advanced into Malaya, moved towards Singapore, overran Hong Kong, and pressed into the Dutch East Indies, seeking control over vital oil and raw materials. By February and March 1942, the map showed a Japanese empire at its widest expanse. Singapore, often described before the war as an impregnable British stronghold, fell on February 15, 1942, along with tens of thousands of Commonwealth troops. In the Dutch East Indies, Japanese naval and air superiority led to the defeat of the combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian (ABDA) fleets in a series of engagements, including the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. The subsequent capitulation of the Dutch forces gave Tokyo control over the oil fields of Sumatra and Borneo, greatly strengthening Japan's strategic position. At the same time, American and Filipino troops in the Philippines were under growing pressure. By January 1942, they had withdrawn to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay. Cut off from effective resupply, short of food, ammunition, and medical support, they continued to resist, but the outcome was not in doubt. The eventual surrender of Bataan in April and Corregidor in May would leave Japan in firm control of the archipelago, further extending Japan's defensive perimeter and depriving the United States of a major forward base in the Western Pacific. The losses at Pearl Harbor had left the United States Pacific Fleet in a precarious condition. On December 7th, the Japanese carrier strike force had severely damaged or sunk 8 American battleships. Although several of those ships would later be raised and repaired, in early 1942 they were largely out of action. American carrier forces, principally USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Lexington, CV-2, USS Saratoga, CV-3, Yorktown, CV-5, and the newly commissioned USS Hornet, CV-8, remained intact and became the primary offensive arm of the Pacific Fleet. Yet the number of available carriers was still small, and the margin for error was thin. From a geographic and logistical perspective, the United States faced enormous challenges. American bases in Hawaii, such as Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field, were still thousands of miles from the Japanese home islands. Midway Atoll, further west, was important but limited in capacity. Guam and Wake Island, 2 other potential forward bases, had fallen to Japanese forces in December 1941. No American airfield existed within range of Japan for conventional land-based bombers. This meant that, despite the desire for retaliation, the United States had no straightforward way to bomb the Japanese home islands in the first months of 1942. Japan's leaders, meanwhile, pursued a grand strategy designed to secure a vast defensive perimeter and force a negotiated peace. By seizing resource-rich territories and creating a line of bases stretching from the Aleutians and the Kuriles in the north, through the Central Pacific, and down to the Solomons and New Guinea in the south, they aimed to create a fortified zone that would be costly for the United States to penetrate. Within this perimeter, Japan hoped to consolidate its gains, exploit resources, and prepare for what it viewed as the inevitable American counteroffensive. Central to Japanese naval doctrine was the concept of a decisive battle between battle fleets, a notion that had roots in pre-war thinking influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan and the experience of the Russo-Japanese War. However, the carriers of the First Air Fleet, often referred to as the Kido Butai, had already demonstrated in 1941 and early 1942 that naval air power now dominated long-range operations. This force, under the overall command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had executed the Pearl Harbor attack and was the primary instrument for Japan's further offensives across the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean. Despite these successes, Yamamoto and other Japanese leaders understood that Japan's position was fundamentally precarious. Japan lacked the industrial and resource base of the United States. Its war plans relied on winning quickly, expanding its territory, and then forcing the enemy to accept Japan's gains because the cost of reversing them would be too high. In Tokyo, there was confidence, but also a sense of urgency. Every month that passed allowed American industry to increase production of ships, aircraft, and munitions. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his senior military advisors were acutely conscious of the political and psychological dimensions of the war. The shock of Pearl Harbor, the news of defeats in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and the constant flow of bad news from the Pacific weighed heavily on public opinion. Roosevelt, who had long emphasized the importance of morale as a component of national strength, sought not only to rebuild the military balance, but also to find a way to demonstrate to the American people that the United States could carry the fight to the enemy. Within the U.S. High Command, several key figures played central roles in the search for offensive options. Admiral Ernest J. King, appointed Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, and later Chief of Naval Operations, was determined to seize the initiative wherever possible. On the Army Air Force's side, General Henry H. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was responsible for developing America's strategic bombing capability and for integrating air power into the broader war effort. Roosevelt pressed King and other senior officers to find a means of striking Japan directly, not only for material effect, but also for symbolic value. The problem was straightforward to define, but difficult to solve. Land-based bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, did not have the range to reach Japan from any base then available to the United States. The Soviet Union, which did have territory within range of Japan, was bound by a neutrality pact with Tokyo signed in April 1941 and showed no willingness to allow American combat operations from its far eastern airfields. Flying bombers across the Pacific from Hawaii or Midway to Japan and then returning was beyond the capabilities of available aircraft and support infrastructure in early 1942. Attention therefore focused on the Navy's carriers. Carrier-based aircraft such as the SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber and TBD Devastator Torpedo Bomber were capable strike platforms but carried relatively light bomb loads and had limited range compared to medium land bombers. While they could and did attack enemy shipping and bases, their ability to reach the Japanese main islands from a safe distance was constrained. Pushing the carriers too close to Japan would risk the few capital ships the United States had left in the Pacific. The loss of one or more carriers could be disastrous. It was against this backdrop that a novel idea began to take shape. Using U.S. Navy carriers not to launch their own small, short-range aircraft, but instead to carry medium Army bombers close enough to Japan to take off, bomb targets on the home islands, and then continue on to friendly bases elsewhere. This concept would require cooperation between the Navy and the Army Air Forces, careful technical preparation, and a willingness to accept very high risks for the crews involved. It would also demand strict secrecy, since advance warning would nullify the element of surprise. In early 1942, as the Japanese advanced toward the frontiers of India and threatened Australia, American carrier forces conducted a series of limited raids on Japanese outposts in the Marshalls, Gilberts, and other islands. These operations, including the early February strikes in the Central Pacific, inflicted modest physical damage but provided valuable operational experience. Nevertheless, these raids could not match the emotional impact of Pearl Harbor, nor could they bring home to the Japanese population that their homeland was vulnerable. Something more direct was sought. It was in this context that several officers began to explore unconventional ways to strike Japan. Among them was Captain Francis S. Lowe, on the staff of Admiral King, who would make a key observation that helped set events in motion. At the same time, within the Army Air Forces, attention turned to which aircraft might conceivably operate from a carrier deck if a plan could be developed. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber emerged as a serious candidate for such an unprecedented mission. The idea, once raised, moved quickly up the chain of command. At the highest levels, Roosevelt's desire for action, King's drive for naval offensives, and Arnold's willingness to commit air assets converged. They would soon turn to a man whose pre-war reputation as an aviation pioneer and problem solver made him a natural choice to organize such a daring experiment. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. By February 1942, the outline of what would become known as the Doolittle Raid was taking form, though many of its details and hazards were not yet fully understood. The conceptual spark for the Doolittle Raid is generally traced to Captain Francis S. Lowe of the U.S. Navy, a submariner serving on the staff of Admiral Ernest J. King. In late January 1942, Lowe observed Army Air Forces bombers training over an airfield where the outline of a carrier deck had been painted on the ground. The sight suggested to him that medium bombers, if properly handled, might be able to take off from an actual carrier. Lowe reported the idea to King, proposing that Army bombers might be launched from a carrier to strike Japan and then continue onward to friendly territory. It was an unorthodox proposal, but King, searching for offensive opportunities, decided it was worth serious exploration. King took the idea to General Henry H. Hap Arnold, whose Army Air Forces would have to supply the aircraft and crews. Arnold, likewise eager for a chance to demonstrate the offensive reach of American air power, agreed to investigate whether the plan was technically feasible. The two men quickly agreed that if such a mission were attempted, it would be under the operational control of the Navy until the bombers launched, and then under the Army Air Forces for the strike itself. It was a classic joint operation in conception, requiring close cooperation between services that often had competing priorities. From these initial discussions emerged the decision to appoint a single, trusted figure to design and lead the mission. That figure was Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. By early 1942, Doolittle was already a widely respected aviator. Before the war, he had earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and had made a name as a test pilot and air racer, setting speed records and pioneering instrument flying. Within the Army Air Forces, he was known as a practical problem solver who combined technical knowledge with operational experience. When Arnold approached him with the outline of the carrier-launched bomber concept, Doolittle accepted the assignment, understanding that it would be both experimental and dangerous. One of the first major decisions concerned the choice of aircraft. Several types were examined, including the B-18 BOLO and the B-23 Dragon, but attention soon focused on the North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. The B-25 offered a combination of relatively compact size, adequate bomb load, and range that made it a more suitable candidate than heavier four-engine bombers. Its twin-engine configuration, strong landing gear, and good takeoff performance suggested that, with modifications and careful handling, it might be able to operate from the short deck run of a carrier. Initial calculations indicated that, if the aircraft could be lightened and fitted with additional fuel tanks, it might reach Japan from a point several hundred miles out at sea and then continue on to airfields in China. To validate these assumptions, practical tests were required. In February 1942, Army pilots flew B-25s from shore onto the deck of a U.S. carrier at sea to practice short-run takeoffs under controlled conditions. These tests, conducted off the U.S. East Coast, demonstrated that a stripped-down B-25 could indeed become airborne within the available deck length, particularly if the carrier steamed into the wind to increase the relative airflow over the wings. The experiments did not resolve all questions about fuel consumption, navigation, and operations in rough weather, but they were sufficient to convince both Navy and Army leaders that the mission was at least technically possible. With the choice of aircraft confirmed, attention turned to modifying the B-25S for the specific requirements of the raid. 16 B-25B aircraft were selected for the mission. They were stripped of non-essential equipment to save weight, including the lower gun turret, some armor, and certain radio sets. To increase range, extra fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay, in the crawlway, and in other internal spaces, bringing total fuel capacity to roughly 1,100 gallons per aircraft. Some defensive armament was reduced, and in a now famous improvisation, dummy gun barrels were installed in the tail to give the impression of a tail gun position. Even though the B-25B had no such weapon in standard configuration, these measures traded defensive capability for range, on the assumption that surprise and speed would be the primary protection. At the same time, Doolittle and his staff began selecting crews. The primary source was the 17th Bomb Group, one of the first units equipped with B-25S, then stationed at Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina. The men of the 17th had experience with the type and had already trained intensively in medium bomber operations. Volunteers were requested for a dangerous mission without details being disclosed. Many stepped forward. From among them, Doolittle and his officers chose the pilots, bombardiers, navigators, engineers, and gunners needed to crew the 16 aircraft, with some additional crews held in reserve. Training was concentrated at Eglin Field in Florida in March 1942. Here, under conditions of strict secrecy, the selected crews practiced techniques that would be vital for the raid. Short field takeoffs were rehearsed repeatedly, with lines painted on the runway to represent the limited deck of a carrier. Pilots learned to bring their aircraft to flying speed in a very short distance, often with partial flaps and precise engine management. They also practiced low-altitude flight over water, navigation using dead reckoning and limited radio aids, and bombing runs from lower altitudes than the standard high-level doctrine of the time. In addition, navigators and pilots studied maps and briefings on the planned routes over Japan and onward to China. The operational concept called for the bombers to be loaded onto a carrier on the U.S. West Coast, transported across the Pacific to within roughly 400 to 450 nautical miles of Japan, and then launched in a single wave. After bombing designated targets in several Japanese cities, the aircraft would continue west-southwest across the East China Sea to airfields in nationalist-controlled China. Coordination with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government and with American advisors in China, including General Claire L. Chennault of the American Volunteer Group, was required to arrange for suitable landing fields, fuel, and assistance. However, the limited development of Chinese airfields and the fluid front lines meant that the plan carried considerable uncertainty. Inter-service coordination was a constant concern. The bombers and their crews were Army, but the platforms that would carry them toward Japan were naval. The carrier selected for the task was USS Hornet, CV-8, a New Yorktown-class carrier commissioned in October 1941. Her commanding officer, Captain Mark Mitcher, had a strong background in naval aviation and was considered well-suited to handling such an unconventional mission. For additional protection and scouting, Hornet would operate together with USS Enterprise, CV-6, under the overall command of Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., whose Task Force 16 had already conducted early 1942 raids in the Central Pacific. Because the B-25S were to occupy the entire flight deck of Hornet, her own air group could not operate normally. The ship's fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes were largely left behind, with only a small number of aircraft stored in the hangar. Enterprise would therefore provide the bulk of the force's scouting and air cover. The task force would include cruisers and destroyers to form a protective screen and supply additional anti-aircraft firepower. The plan emphasized speed, radio silence, and a direct approach route designed to minimize the risk of detection by Japanese patrols and picket vessels. Secrecy surrounded virtually every aspect of the preparation. The crews at Eglin were not told their exact target until late in the training period, though many guessed that Japan was involved. On the West Coast, when Hornet took the modified B-25S aboard at Alameda, California, on April 1, 1942, onlookers saw the unusual sight of large Army bombers lashed to the carrier's flight deck. Security personnel discouraged questions, and only a limited number of officers knew the full plan. Even within the task force, many sailors and airmen were initially unaware of the mission's destination. This compartmentalization was intended to reduce the risk that information might leak, whether through casual conversation or enemy espionage. By late March, final arrangements were in place. Doolittle's aircraft and crews flew to the modification centers, then on to McClellan Field in California, and from there to Alameda, where they were craned onto Hornet's deck and secured in 2 rows, their wings overlapping slightly to conserve space. Each bomber carried a mix of general-purpose high-explosive bombs and incendiaries, reflecting the dual intention of hitting industrial facilities and starting fires in urban areas. Additional provisions, emergency rations, and maps for use in China were also stowed aboard. Command relationships were carefully defined. Halsey, flying his flag in Enterprise, would command the task force at sea, deciding the approach route, speed, and launch point. Doolittle, aboard Hornet, commanded the bomber detachment and would determine tactical details of the air operation. Once the aircraft lifted off from the carrier, Halsey's direct control would end. From that point, the Army Air Force's crews would execute their briefed attack plans and attempt to reach their recovery fields in China. Both commanders understood that the success of the raid depended on timing, weather, and the ability to avoid early detection by Japanese patrol lines. On April 2, 1942, Task Force 16 departed San Francisco Bay and headed west across the Pacific. Hornet steamed with 16 B-25S secured on her flight deck, an unprecedented sight in naval history. Enterprise and the accompanying cruisers and destroyers took up their positions around her. For the men aboard, the voyage began like many others, with drills, watches, and routine duties, but with an added layer of tension born of secrecy and anticipation. Ahead lay an approach to Japan that would test not only the skills of the air crews and ship handlers, but also the underlying assumption that America could reach into the heart of the Japanese Empire far sooner than Tokyo believed possible. As Task Force 16 moved westward across the Pacific in early April 1942, the operation entered its most dangerous phase. The American carriers USS Hornet and USS Enterprise, along with their escorts, were advancing into waters increasingly patrolled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The closer they came to Japan, the greater the risk that submarines, long-range aircraft, or surface patrols would detect them. Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., commanding the task force, understood that he was placing 2 of the U.S. Navy's few operational carriers in harm's way. The potential gain was significant, but so was the danger of a crippling loss. The composition of the force reflected both the ambition and the caution of the plan. Hornet, carrying Doolittle's 16 B-25S on her flight deck, was effectively a transport and launch platform for the Army bombers. Her own embarked air group was minimal and largely confined below in the hangar. Enterprise, by contrast, retained her normal complement of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. She served as the task force's primary eye and shield, launching scouting missions to search for enemy ships and providing combat air patrols to guard against surprise attacks from the air. The escorting force included heavy cruisers USS Northampton and USS Vincennes, light cruisers USS Nashville and USS Atlanta, and several destroyers. Their role was to screen the carriers against surface and submarine threats and to add their anti-aircraft batteries to the overall defense. The entire formation operated under strict radio silence, communicating internally with signal flags, blinkers, and other visual methods whenever possible. Silence was essential to avoid detection by Japanese direction-finding stations, which might otherwise pick up and triangulate radio transmissions. Weather and sea conditions added another layer of uncertainty. The North Pacific in April could be rough, with heavy swells, strong winds, and low clouds. While overcast skies could help shield the task force from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, they also made scouting and navigation more difficult. For the B-25 crews, who periodically came up on Hornet's flight deck to examine the limited runway ahead of them and feel the motion of the ship underfoot, the persistent rolling of the carrier was a reminder that their eventual takeoff would be unlike any training exercise in Florida. The Japanese had, by early 1942, established an outer ring of picket boats, small armed trawlers and patrol craft, at considerable distances from the home islands. Their task was to provide early warning of any approaching enemy force. These picket lines were an economy measure. Rather than keeping major warships constantly at sea, the Japanese relied on these modest vessels to serve as distant sentries. Their reports, sent by radio, could trigger the dispatch of aircraft or larger ships to investigate and, if possible, attack any intruding enemy units. American planners were aware of the existence of these patrols, though their precise locations and density were not fully known. Halsey's approach route was chosen to reduce the likelihood of an early encounter, but there could be no guarantee of complete secrecy. As the task force advanced to within 1,000 miles of Japan, tension increased. Scouting aircraft from Enterprise flew wide arcs ahead and to the flanks, searching for any sign of enemy vessels that might raise the alarm. The plan called for Doolittle's bombers to launch at a point approximately 400 to 450 nautical miles east of Japan. From that distance, even with additional fuel tanks, the B-25S would be operating near the limits of their range, especially considering the need to cross Japan, bomb their targets, and then continue on to airfields in China. The timing of the launch was also critical. The aircraft were to take off in the early morning, reach their targets around midday, and then fly on in the afternoon and evening, hoping to arrive over friendly Chinese territory before fuel exhaustion forced them down. On the morning of April 18, 1942, events forced a major alteration to this carefully constructed plan. At dawn, the task force was still more than 600 miles from Japan, proceeding westward through increasingly dangerous waters. Around 7:38 local time, the American ships sighted a small Japanese vessel. It was one of the picket boats, the armed trawler Nito Maru, part of the Japanese 26th Air Flotilla's distant early warning net. The destroyer USS Monson was ordered to engage. As the American destroyer opened fire and closed in, Nito Maru transmitted contact reports by radio, indicating the presence of enemy ships. Although Monson and other American units succeeded in sinking Nito Maru and several additional small craft encountered shortly thereafter, the damage had likely been done. Halsey and his staff, along with Doolittle aboard Hornet, had to assume that at least one distress message had reached Japanese receivers. If so, land-based bombers or carrier forces might be dispatched to investigate. The risk to the task force, still hundreds of miles from its intended launch point, increased sharply with each passing hour. Halsey now faced a difficult command decision. If the task force turned back, the mission would be aborted and the opportunity to strike Japan might be lost for some time. If he pressed on toward the original launch point, he would be moving two precious carriers even closer to the Japanese homeland under conditions of probable enemy alert. After consultation with Doolittle and his own senior officers, Halsey decided on a compromise. The bombers would be launched immediately from a position far east of the planned point, about 650 to 700 nautical miles from Japan, while the carriers and escorts turned away to the east and cleared the area as quickly as possible. This decision had profound implications for the bomber crews. The additional 200 to 300 miles they would have to cover before reaching Japan, and the same added distance after the attack before they could hope to reach Chinese airfields, pushed their fuel situation from marginal to critical. The extra distance made it extremely unlikely that any of the aircraft could reach their designated recovery bases in China under daylight conditions. Doolittle understood that this meant a much higher probability that his men would be forced to bail out in darkness or attempt hazardous crash landings with nearly empty fuel tanks. Despite these dangers, there was no serious suggestion of canceling the raid once the task force had been detected. The political and psychological stakes were high, and the raid had already progressed too far to be easily reversed. Doolittle agreed with Halsey that an immediate launch offered the best chance of achieving the primary objective, delivering a blow against the Japanese home islands. Orders went out to the B-25 crews to prepare for takeoff. Final checks were made on fuel loads, bomb fusing, and navigation equipment. The men put on their gear, some carrying sidearms or small personal items they hoped to keep with them if forced down in China. Sea conditions on the morning of April 18th were far from ideal. A stiff wind and heavy swells caused Hornet to pitch and roll. For carrier aviation, such a headwind could be an advantage, as the ship's speed into the wind increased the effective airflow over the wings of aircraft taking off. For the larger, heavier B-25s, however, the combination of deck motion and short takeoff run posed a serious challenge. Captain Mark Mitcher ordered Hornet turn directly into the wind and drove the carrier at maximum safe speed to provide the best possible takeoff conditions. The 16 B-25s were arranged nose to tail along the flight deck, leaving only a relatively short run from the first aircraft's starting point to the bow. Doolittle's plane, designated aircraft number 402344 and known as ship number 1 in the formation, was positioned at the very front. At approximately 8:20, Doolittle received the signal to begin. He advanced the throttles to full power, held the brakes to allow the engines to build up thrust, then released them and began the takeoff roll. As Hornet's bow rose and fell with the swells, Doolittle had to time his liftoff carefully. With flaps set and engines at maximum, the bomber gathered speed, reached the end of the deck, and dropped momentarily toward the sea before its wings bit into the air and it climbed away. One by one, the remaining 15 B-25s followed. Each crew faced the same narrow margin between flight and disaster. The pilots had trained intensively for short takeoffs, but none had done so under true carrier conditions before this day. The deck crews of Hornet guided each aircraft into position, chalked the wheels, and signaled when it was time to go. Engines roared, propellers whipped up spray from the wind-streaked sea, and the bombers rolled forward. Some appeared to skim dangerously close to the water before gaining height. Nonetheless, all 16 aircraft became airborne successfully, an achievement that testified to both careful preparation and the skill of the Air Corps pilots and the ship's handling. Before launch, each aircraft had been assigned a general route and target. Several were directed against Tokyo, the principal political and industrial center of Japan. Others were tasked to bomb Yokohama, a major port and industrial city, Yokosuka, an important naval base south of Tokyo, Nagoya, a leading industrial center, and Kobe and Osaka in the Kansai region. Within these cities, specific target areas included dockyards, oil storage tanks, steel and machine tool plants, and other war-related facilities. The aim was not to destroy entire complexes. That would have been impossible with such a small striking force, but to demonstrate that American bombers could penetrate Japanese airspace and damage key objectives. Once airborne, the B-25s formed loose elements as they departed the vicinity of the task force. There was no practical way to maintain a tight formation over the entire distance to Japan and onward to China, especially given the need for low-altitude flight over the ocean to avoid early radar or visual detection. Each crew was responsible for its own navigation, using maps, compasses, drift measurements, and occasional glimpses of the sea surface through breaks in the weather. Radio silence was maintained to reduce the chance of interception. Behind them, as soon as the last aircraft had cleared the deck, Halsey ordered the task force to turn away from Japan and increase speed to withdraw to the east. For the sailors aboard Hornet and Enterprise, the dramatic takeoff sequence was the last visible act of the raid. They would play no part in the bombing itself, nor in the hazardous journeys of the bomber crews toward China. Their task now was to bring the carriers safely back to Pearl Harbor, preserving the core of the Pacific Fleet's offensive capability for battles still to come. Ahead of the B-25s lay several hours of overwater flight before the coast of Japan would come into view. Fuel calculations were already tight, and each small deviation from the planned route or change in altitude could affect consumption. Yet for the first time in the war, American combat aircraft were on their way directly toward the Japanese home islands. The next phase of the operation would unfold not on the decks of carriers or at sea, but in the skies above Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and other cities that until that day had believed themselves beyond the reach of American weapons. For the 16 B-25s that had just left USS Hornet's deck, the first hours of flight were spent entirely over water. The crews flew at low altitude, in most cases between 150 and 300 meters above the sea, to reduce the chance of radar detection and visual sighting by Japanese patrol aircraft or shipping. Navigators checked their courses frequently, using compass headings, airspeed, estimated drift, and occasional reference to the wave patterns below. There were no escorts, no rescue ships, and no turning back. The bombers pressed on alone toward a coastline none of their crews had ever seen in wartime. As the aircraft closed the distance to Japan, weather conditions varied. Some crews reported broken clouds and intermittent mist. Others had relatively clear air. The plan called for the B-25s to approach the coast at low level, then adjust altitude as needed for their bombing runs. The extended launch distance that morning meant that time over the target had slipped later than originally intended. By late morning and around midday, individual bombers were making landfall over eastern Honshu, spreading out along a broad front that would bring them over Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and other objectives in the Kanto and Tokai regions. In April 1942, Japanese civil defense preparations were still at an early stage. Major cities had air raid drills, some shelters, and limited blackout procedures, but few in Tokyo or elsewhere expected hostile aircraft to appear in daylight from the east. The main perceived threats were Soviet aircraft from the north or occasional high-altitude reconnaissance from other directions. The idea that American bombers, launched from unknown origins across the Pacific, could reach the capital within months of Pearl Harbor did not figure prominently in Japanese planning. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle's aircraft was among the first to reach Tokyo. Approaching the city, his crew climbed modestly for the bombing run, then descended to complete their attack at relatively low altitude. The B-25s carried a mixture of 500-pound general-purpose bombs and clusters of incendiaries designed to ignite fires in industrial and urban areas. Each aircraft could only deliver a limited load, but the targets chosen, oil storage tanks, factories, dockyards, and rail facilities, were intended to have both material and psychological impact. Over Tokyo, The sudden appearance of American bombers caused initial confusion. Air raid sirens sounded as the first bombs began to fall. Anti-aircraft batteries around the city opened fire, but their response was not as concentrated or effective as it would later become in the war. Some accounts describe relatively light flak near the city center, with heavier bursts near military or industrial districts. Japanese fighter units scrambled Ki-27 and Ki-43 Army fighters and A-6M0 naval fighters from nearby fields. But the number of interceptors that actually engaged the B-25S was small and their response fragmented. The bombers flew individual attack runs rather than in tight formation. Some crews came in higher, others at rooftop height over suburban districts and factory zones. Targets hit in Tokyo and its vicinity included an oil tank farm, a steel works, and parts of the urban fabric near rail lines and industrial plants. Fires were started in several locations. Although the total bomb tonnage dropped, around 16 tons in all, was modest by later wartime standards, the effect on the population and leadership was disproportionate to the physical damage. In Yokohama and Yokosuka, other B-25S struck dockyards, warehouses, and naval facilities. One aircraft attacked the Yokosuka Naval Base area, home to shipyards and support installations for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Nagoya, a major center of aircraft and industrial production, received attacks on factories and infrastructure, including facilities linked to the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works and other war industries. In Kobe and nearby areas, port installations and industrial zones were targeted. Some bombs fell in residential districts, causing civilian casualties and structural damage. Japanese anti-aircraft fire and the limited fighter opposition did inflict some damage. Several B-25S were holed by flak, suffered minor structural damage, or lost fuel from punctured tanks. One crew reported a Japanese fighter making a firing pass, which they claimed to have driven off with return fire from the bomber's guns. Nonetheless, all 16 aircraft completed their bombing runs and exited Japanese airspace, turning southwest toward the East China Sea and, beyond it, the hoped for refuge of Chinese airfields. After leaving their targets, the crews faced what many would later describe as the most difficult phase of the mission. The extra distance flown due to the early launch meant that fuel reserves were dangerously low. Weather over the East China Sea and coastal China deteriorated as a frontal system brought low clouds, rain, and strong winds. Visibility dropped, making navigation more uncertain. The prearranged Chinese airfields, located in areas of eastern China under nationalist control, were difficult to find even in good conditions. Several of the intended fields had also been recently overrun by Japanese forces or rendered unusable, a fact that not all American planners fully appreciated. As daylight faded into evening, most of the B-25S were still over water or just reaching the Chinese coast. Crewmen monitored fuel gauges that were dropping toward empty. Doolittle's own aircraft, like the others, had no realistic chance of reaching an airfield with enough fuel to attempt a normal landing. The plan had always implicitly accepted that, if necessary, the crews would bail out or crash land once they were over friendly or at least non-Japanese held territory. Now that contingency became reality. Shortly before midnight on 18 to 19 April, Doolittle and his crew bailed out near the Chinese coast after flying as far inland as their fuel would allow. They landed separately in rough terrain, but were eventually reunited with help from Chinese civilians and local forces. Doolittle, who had privately feared that losing all 16 aircraft would lead to a court-martial, quickly learned that his men were scattered over a wide area. A number of crews, including that of Lieutenant Ted W. Lawson, later known for his memoir 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, also bailed out or crash-landed in eastern China. Lawson's aircraft, heavily damaged and short of fuel, attempted a night landing near a coastal airfield and crashed, leaving him and several crewmen seriously injured. Of the 16 bombers, 15 headed toward China. All 15 were lost through crash landings, ditching, or crew bailouts. One aircraft, however, plane number 8, piloted by Captain Edward J. York, took a different course. Low on fuel and uncertain of its position relative to Chinese fields, York's crew decided to divert to the Soviet Union's far eastern region, calculating that Vladivostok was within reach. They landed there with minimal fuel remaining. Because the Soviet Union was officially neutral with Japan under the 1941 Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, Soviet authorities interned the crew rather than allowing them to continue the fight openly. After a period of controlled movement within the Soviet Union and a somewhat circuitous journey, they eventually made their way out via Central Asia and Iran, rejoining American forces later in the war. For the crews downed in China, the days and weeks following the raid were marked by a combination of hardship, danger, and local assistance. Many airmen landed in mountainous or rural areas, often at night and in bad weather. Some suffered injuries from parachute descents or crashes. Chinese civilians and guerrillas played a crucial role in rescuing and sheltering the Americans. Villagers provided food, clothing, and guides. Nationalist army units and local resistance groups helped move the crews away from areas threatened by Japanese patrols, arranging transport by foot, by horse, or sometimes by makeshift vehicles across considerable distances. American personnel also encountered the complex political and military landscape of wartime China. Nationalist authorities, including representatives linked to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's government and to General Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group, assisted in gathering and evacuating the raiders. The terrain, poor roads, and shifting front lines made movement slow. Several crews were forced to travel for weeks before reaching safe locations in interior China from which they could be moved onward to bases in India or elsewhere. Not all the raiders evaded capture. 8 airmen from 2 of the downed crews, primarily from aircraft commanded by Captains Dean Hallmark and William Farrow and Lieutenant Robert Height, fell into Japanese hands and occupied China. They were taken as prisoners and subjected to interrogation by Japanese military authorities, who were determined to learn the origin and details of the raid. The prisoners were eventually moved to Shanghai and other locations, held largely in isolation with limited information about the outside world. In 1942, a Japanese military court tried these captured airmen on charges related to bombing non-military targets and endangering civilians. The proceedings did not conform to recognized standards of fairness. 3 of the prisoners, Farrow, Hallmark, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad in October 1942. 5 others received prison sentences. One of these, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, and several of his comrades endured harsh conditions for years. One prisoner, Lieutenant Hugh Hallmark, died of disease and malnutrition. Only 4 of the 8 captured Doolittle Raiders survived to be liberated at the end of the war in 1945. In total, of the 80 men who took off from Hornet on April 18th, 3 were killed during the initial crashes and bailouts in China, and 8 became prisoners of the Japanese. The majority eventually reached safety and rejoined American forces. Many later served in other theaters of war. Their individual experiences varied widely, from relatively quick recovery and evacuation to prolonged hardship or captivity, but together they formed a mosaic of the human cost behind the brief headlines of American bombers raid Tokyo. For the crews who reached friendly territory, news eventually filtered through that the raid had indeed struck Japan's home islands, and that the American public had responded with enthusiasm and relief. At the time, however, scattered in the mountains and villages of eastern China or confined in distant prison cells, most of the raiders could not yet grasp the full impact of their mission. They knew only that they had carried out their orders, survived against difficult odds, and demonstrated that Japan was not beyond the reach of American air power. News of the bombing reached Japanese authorities within hours on April 18, 1942. Reports from Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities indicated that small groups of enemy bombers, identified as twin-engine land planes rather than carrier aircraft, had appeared over the capital and key industrial centers in broad daylight. The initial assessment in Tokyo was one of surprise and disbelief. For months, Japanese propaganda had emphasized the safety of the home islands and the remoteness of direct American attack. Now, fires were burning in Tokyo itself. At the highest levels of the Japanese government and military, the raid created immediate concern. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and senior Army and Navy leaders quickly convened to assess the situation. The essential facts soon emerged. American aircraft had bombed the capital and other cities, causing modest physical damage but posing an ominous strategic question: how had they reached Japan? Early theories included the possibility of aircraft flying from carriers that had somehow come unusually close, or from secret bases in the Aleutians, the Soviet Far East, or even China. The presence of medium bombers, however, pointed strongly to an origin on land rather than from conventional carrier operations. As fragments of wreckage and intelligence were examined over time, Japanese analysts concluded that the aircraft were likely B-25 bombers and that they had probably taken off from a carrier somewhere in the Western Pacific, then flown onward to China. This implied that American naval forces had approached far closer to Japan than had previously been considered likely, using methods that Japanese defensive planning had not fully anticipated. The raid therefore called into question the adequacy of Japan's distant early warning system and the inviolability of the home island's airspace. Within the Japanese armed forces, reactions were mixed and, in some quarters, accusatory. The Imperial Navy, responsible for protecting the approaches to the home islands, came under criticism from some Army officers and government figures who believed that the Navy had failed to prevent an enemy strike at the very heart of the empire. The Navy, in turn, pointed to the inherent difficulty of maintaining constant, dense patrol lines across vast ocean areas and noted that the picket boats had, in fact, detected the approaching American task force, though too late to prevent the launch. The raid deepened existing rivalries between the services and intensified debates over priorities in resource allocation for air defense, fleet operations, and coastal security. In practical terms, Japanese authorities moved quickly to strengthen homeland air defenses. Additional fighter units were assigned to the vicinity of Tokyo and other major cities. Anti-aircraft gun positions were reinforced and better integrated into a centralized command system. Civil defense regulations, including blackouts, air raid drills, and shelter provisions, were tightened. Efforts were made to expand radar coverage and improve coordination between Army and Navy air units. While these measures could not wholly eliminate the risk of future raids, they reflected a new recognition that the home islands were no longer immune from air attack. The most far-reaching and tragic consequences of the raid, however, were felt not in Japan but in occupied China. Japanese commanders in China and the home islands quickly concluded that Chinese civilians and nationalist forces had aided the downed American airmen. Orders went out to punish and deter such assistance. In the summer of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army launched a large punitive campaign in the Chinese provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, where many of the raiders had landed or passed through. This operation, often referred to by historians as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, combined conventional military objectives with systematic reprisals against the local population. Japanese forces moved through towns and villages suspected of assisting the Americans, destroying houses, crops, and infrastructure. Mass executions, forced labor, and other atrocities were reported by Chinese sources and later confirmed in post-war investigations. In addition, Japanese biological warfare units, including the notorious Unit 731 and related formations, are documented as having tested plague and other pathogens during the campaign, contributing to disease outbreaks among Chinese civilians and soldiers. Estimates of Chinese deaths resulting directly or indirectly from this punitive operation vary, but many historians place the figure in the range of tens of thousands, and some Chinese accounts suggest even higher numbers. For the nationalist Chinese government and population, the Doolittle Raid therefore had a dual character. On the one hand, the arrival of American airmen and the knowledge that the United States had struck Japan's home islands were sources of encouragement, reinforcing the idea that China was not alone and that American power would eventually be brought fully to bear against the Axis. On the other hand, the brutal Japanese reprisals that followed imposed an immense human cost on Chinese communities that had aided or simply lived near the routes of the American crews. This tension between symbolic victory and heavy local sacrifice would shape Chinese memory of the raid in subsequent decades. In the United States, news of the operation reached the public several days after the event. Initial reports were cautious, reflecting security considerations and the desire not to reveal operational details that might aid the enemy. On April 21, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced that American bombers had struck military targets in Japan. He did not specify the launching method or bases used. When asked by journalists where the planes had come from, Roosevelt is reported to have answered with a deliberately fictional reference. He said they had taken off from Shangri-La, a mythical Himalayan valley popularized in the novel Lost Horizon. The phrase both concealed the carrier origin and added an air of mystery that captured public imagination. American newspapers and radio broadcasts quickly seized on the story. Headlines emphasized the bombing of Tokyo, the first direct American blow at the Japanese capital. The scale of the attack was small compared to the Luftwaffe's raids on British cities or later Allied strategic bombing campaigns in Europe and Asia, but this mattered less than the psychological effect. For a public that had endured the shock of Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, and the worsening news from the Philippines, the Doolittle Raid offered tangible proof that the United States could and would strike back. Morale indicators from the period, editorials, letters, and contemporary commentary show a marked uplift in confidence and resolve. The raid did not erase the harsh realities of early 1942, but it helped change the emotional tenor of the war for many Americans. Instead of an unbroken string of Allied setbacks, the Doolittle Raid stood out as an example of American initiative, ingenuity, and daring. It reinforced Roosevelt's broader message that, despite early losses, American industrial and military power was mobilizing and would ultimately overpower the Axis. Within the U.S. military, the raid also had a strong symbolic resonance. It demonstrated successful cooperation between the Navy and the Army Air Forces in planning and executing a complex joint operation. Naval officers saw that their carriers could be used not only with their own embarked aircraft, but also as launch platforms for unconventional missions. Army Air Forces leaders took pride in the performance of the B-25 crews and the technical success of launching medium bombers from a carrier. The mission suggested new possibilities for projecting air power across great distances using maritime platforms and inter-service coordination. James H. Doolittle's personal post-raid experience reflected the gap between his own expectations and the public reaction. Having lost all 16 aircraft, he initially believed that he might face criticism or even a court-martial. Instead, he found himself celebrated as a national hero. On May 19, 1942, in a ceremony at the White House, President Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor for conspicuous leadership above the call of duty, involving personal valor and intrepidity at an extreme hazard to life. In conjunction with the award, Doolittle was promoted from lieutenant colonel directly to brigadier general, a rare leap that underscored the symbolic weight assigned to the mission. Many of the other raiders received decorations as well, including the Distinguished Flying Cross and other awards. Those who could be identified as missing or captured were honored in absentia. After the war, when the surviving prisoners returned, their endurance and sacrifice were further recognized. Over time, the Doolittle Raiders became a distinct group in American military culture, holding reunions, receiving commemorations, and serving as a living link to the early, uncertain months of the Pacific War. On the Japanese side, public information about the raid was tightly controlled. Government and military censors limited reporting on the extent of damage and casualties, framing the event as a minor incursion by a small number of enemy aircraft, all of which were said to have been shot down or prevented from returning. Nonetheless, word spread that American planes had bombed Tokyo and other cities. For many ordinary Japanese, the raid was a first hint that the war might eventually bring destruction to the home islands themselves. While it did not immediately undermine broad support for the war effort, it introduced a new sense of vulnerability that would grow as the conflict progressed. Strategically, senior Japanese leaders drew several lessons from the raid. They recognized the need to improve air defenses and to reinforce the outer perimeter to keep American carriers at greater distances. More importantly, the raid contributed to an emerging consensus within the Imperial Navy leadership, already shaped by other factors, that the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers had to be destroyed before they could mount further, more damaging operations. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had already been advocating an ambitious operation to draw out and annihilate the American carriers, found in the Doolittle Raid additional justification for his plans. In the months that followed, these strategic deliberations would help lead Japan toward one of the pivotal confrontations of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. While the Doolittle Raid did not, by itself, determine Japanese strategy, it played a significant part in sharpening fears about the vulnerability of the home islands and strengthening the argument for a decisive carrier battle that, Japanese planners hoped, would secure Japan's defensive perimeter once and for all. In that sense, the shock of a relatively small raid contributed to decisions that would have far larger consequences for the course of the war. In the immediate tactical sense, the Doolittle Raid inflicted limited material damage on Japan. Approximately 16 tons of bombs fell on several cities, causing fires, the destruction or impairment of some factories, warehouses, and oil facilities, and civilian and military casualties that, while painful locally, did not seriously affect Japan's overall war production in 1942. Yet from a strategic and psychological perspective, the raid had a disproportionately large influence. Its long-term impact can be traced through Japanese decision-making, American operational development, Sino-American relations, and post-war memory on all sides. Within the Imperial Japanese Navy, the raid reinforced Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's conviction that the remaining American carriers had to be brought to battle and destroyed. Even before April 1942, Yamamoto had been pressing for a decisive operation in the Central Pacific. His concept, developed in late 1941 and early 1942, called for an assault on Midway Atoll, intended to draw out the U.S. Pacific Fleet's carriers so that the First Air Fleet could annihilate them in a carefully prepared ambush. This proposal met resistance from some officers in the Naval General Staff, who prefer to focus on consolidating gains in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. The Doolittle Raid strengthened Yamamoto's hand in these internal debates. The fact that American carriers had approached to within roughly 650 to 700 nautical miles of Japan and launched medium bombers that struck Tokyo and other cities was a public embarrassment and a strategic alarm. To many in the Japanese leadership, it demonstrated that as long as U.S. carriers remained in being, the home islands were potentially vulnerable. Yamamoto and his supporters used the raid as evidence that a bold, decisive action was necessary to remove this threat. By late April and May 1942, the Midway Operation Plan was adopted and set in motion. Historians differ on how much weight to assign the Doolittle Raid in this process. Some argue that Japanese planning for Midway was already well advanced by early 1942 and that the raid served mainly as a convenient justification rather than a primary cause. Others emphasize the way in which the psychological impact of the raid accelerated the decision to commit the core of the carrier force to a high-risk operation far from home. Japanese documents from the period, including staff discussions and post-war testimony by surviving officers, suggest that the raid was not the sole driver of policy, but it did sharpen perceptions of urgency and vulnerability. In any case, the chain of events is clear. Less than 2 months after the Doolittle Raid, in early June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy's principal carrier striking force sailed for Midway. In the ensuing battle, fought from 4 to June 7th, U.S. Navy dive bombers from carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet achieved a decisive victory, sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with many of their experienced aircrews. This loss fundamentally shifted the balance of carrier power in the Pacific and put Japan on the defensive for the remainder of the war. The Doolittle Raid also had more subtle effects on Japanese resource allocation. In response to the April 1942 attack, Japan strengthened its air defenses at home, deploying additional fighter units and anti-aircraft guns to the Tokyo area and other major cities. Radar installations were expanded, and more aircraft were retained for homeland defense rather than being sent to forward areas. While the numbers involved did not cripple Japanese frontline strength, they did represent a diversion of some assets away from offensive operations and contributed incrementally to the broader strain on Japan's limited industrial and logistical capacity. For the United States, the raid served as an early demonstration of the flexibility and reach of carrier task forces. The concept of using a carrier to project land-based bombers was unique and would not be repeated in exactly the same form later in the war, once long-range bombers could operate from captured or newly constructed bases in the Western Pacific. However, the operation underscored the idea that naval aviation could bring air power to the enemy's doorstep without the need for nearby land bases. This principle would be manifested on a far larger scale from 1943 onward, as U.S. fast carrier task forces conducted massive raids on Japanese bases, shipping, and eventually the home islands themselves. The raid also contributed to the evolution of joint operations doctrine in the U.S. Armed Forces. Coordinating the Army Air Force's medium bombers with Navy carriers and task force escorts required unusual levels of planning across service lines. Although inter-service rivalry did not disappear, the success of the mission offered a practical example of the benefits of cooperation, an idea that would later be institutionalized in joint planning staffs and theater commands. In a broader sense, the Doolittle Raid foreshadowed the kind of integrated land-sea-air operations that became characteristic of Allied campaigns in both the Pacific and European theaters. On a personal level, the careers of several key participants intersected with later milestones in the war. James H. Doolittle did not remain a symbol of a single bold raid. He went on to command significant air formations. Later in 1942, he was given command of the 12th Air Force in the North African Campaign, overseeing tactical and medium bomber operations in support of Allied ground forces. Subsequently, he commanded the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean and, in January 1944, took over the 8th Air Force in England, directing strategic bombing operations against Germany. Over the course of the war, Doolittle's leadership extended far beyond the April 1942 raid that bore his name. Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., who had commanded the task force that delivered the B-25S to their launch point, later became one of the most prominent American naval commanders in the Pacific. After periods of illness and reassignment, he took command of the South Pacific area, overseeing campaigns in the Solomons and other key operations. By 1944, as a fleet admiral, he led one of the main U.S. carrier task forces in the Philippines and Western Pacific, playing a central role in the final naval battles against Japan. For Halsey, the Doolittle Raid was an early example of the aggressive use of carriers that would characterize his later actions. The long-term impact of the raid in China was profound, though often overshadowed in Western narratives by events at sea. The Jiangxi campaign of 1942, launched as a direct reprisal for Chinese assistance to the raiders, devastated large swathes of eastern China. The destruction of villages, the killing and displacement of civilians, and the use of biological weapons left deep scars. In Chinese historical memory, the Doolittle Raid remains linked not only to American bravery, but also to the heavy price paid by local populations. Post-war Chinese accounts highlight the solidarity shown by villagers and guerrillas who sheltered the airmen, alongside the suffering that followed. After 1945, as the international order and alliances shifted, the raid took on different meanings in the United States, Japan, and China. In the United States, it quickly entered the canon of World War II stories, celebrated in books, periodicals, and films. Ted Lawson's memoir, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, published in 1943, and the 1944 film adaptation brought the story to a wide audience even before the war ended. These narratives emphasized the courage of the air crews, the ingenuity required to launch medium bombers from a carrier, and the raid's uplifting effect on American morale. For Japan, the raid became one episode in a larger narrative of the aerial war that would, by 1945, include devastating conventional and atomic bombing of the home islands. In the immediate post-war years, Japanese reflection focused more heavily on the catastrophic raids of 1944 to 1945, such as the firebombing of Tokyo on the night of 9 to 10 March 1945, which killed tens of thousands. The 1942 raid, by comparison, seemed small. Nonetheless, within military histories and memoirs, it retained its significance as a warning that had not been fully heeded, a signal that the war would eventually bring destruction to Japan itself. Among the Doolittle Raiders, post-war years were marked by continued service, adjustment to civilian life, and the cultivation of a close-knit veterans community. Beginning in the 1940s, they held periodic reunions. At the heart of these gatherings was a set of 80 silver goblets, each engraved with the name of a raider, stored in a special case. At reunions, the goblets of those who had died were turned upside down in quiet remembrance. This tradition, along with the preservation of artifacts such as one of the original B-25s restored for display, helped keep the memory of the mission alive as the participants aged and their numbers declined. The raid is also remembered in museums, monuments, and educational materials. Exhibits at institutions such as the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and various naval museums present the operation within the broader context of the Pacific War. These displays typically emphasize not only the technical novelty of the carrier-launched bombers, but also the international dimensions of the raid, including Chinese assistance and Soviet internment. Over time, scholarship has broadened to include Chinese and Japanese perspectives, giving a more complete view of the raid's consequences. From a modern analytical standpoint, the Doolittle Raid offers several enduring lessons. It illustrates how operations with limited direct military impact can nonetheless exert substantial influence through psychological and political channels. It shows the value of innovation under pressure, as officers and planners found a way to combine existing platforms, the B-25 and the fleet carrier, in an unconventional manner to achieve a strategic objective. It underscores the importance of understanding second and third-order effects, such as reprisals against civilian populations, which can shape the ethical and historical evaluation of even successful operations. In assessing the raid's place in the Pacific War, Most historians agree that it did not change the fundamental material balance between Japan and the United States. That shift was driven primarily by American industrial production, attritional battles at sea and in the air, and the gradual constriction of Japan's access to resources. Yet the Doolittle Raid did help accelerate certain Japanese decisions, notably regarding Midway, and contributed to a growing sense of inevitability about the reach of American power. For the United States, it marked an early step away from pure reaction toward a more assertive, offensive posture. By April 1942, the United States was still at the beginning of its wartime mobilization. Aircraft production, shipbuilding, and troop training were expanding but had not yet reached their peak. In that context, the Doolittle Raid can be seen as a symbolic harbinger of what was to come, a relatively small, risky strike that carried a message out of proportion to the tonnage of bombs dropped. It told Japan that its home islands could be reached. It told the American public that the nation was no longer confined to absorbing blows but had begun to deliver them. In the long arc of the Pacific War, the raid stands as a reminder that the first signs of a turning tide are often psychological as much as material, and that a single, daring operation can resonate far beyond its immediate battlefield results. If you enjoyed this historical story, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps support the creation of new content and ensures you will not miss upcoming stories about the Second World War.